The medieval tavern, often romanticized in modern culture as a cozy retreat, was in harsh reality a volatile nexus of community, commerce, vice, and relentless danger. Far from the sanitized image portrayed in fantasy, these institutions were the smoky, sticky, and gloriously chaotic heart of medieval life, serving simultaneously as the unofficial town hall, stock exchange, employment office, and entertainment center. The compelling narrative of the medieval tavern, the story that captivates its audience, lies precisely in the thin, volatile line between civilization and chaos, where survival was never guaranteed, and the unwary could lose everything before the night was through. The primary dramatic element that hooks an audience is the sheer overwhelming reality of the environment. The first impression upon entering a 14th century tavern was a physical assault on the senses. A complex bouquet of unwashed humanity, sour ale, acrid smoke from poorly ventilated fires, and the unmistakable odor of things left to ferment. The floors, often packed earth covered with rushes, were an unpredictable, spongy landscape, slowly decomposing into an ecosystem of spilled food, organic matter, and the occasional small corpse of vermin. Walls constructed of wattle and daub were blackened with smoke and grease, while the low, oppressive ceilings seemed to press down on occupants. The air itself was thick enough to chew, laden with soot, grease particles, and the exhalations of dozens of people for whom bathing was, at best, a seasonal activity. This visceral atmosphere immediately sets a scene of discomfort and primal urgency, highlighting that every breath was an adventure. Yet, despite the danger and the assault on the senses, the air pulsed with a raw vitality, a humanity stripped of pretense, seeking food, drink, companionship, and the occasional release of violence. A central theme of the tavern narrative is the critical role of alcohol, driven by necessity rather than mere indulgence. In a world where water was a flowing cocktail of human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff, drinking ale or wine was often literally safer than drinking water. The boiling process required for brewing killed the harmful bacteria that contaminated untreated water, meaning alcohol consumption began at birth and continued until death just to stay alive and healthy. This fundamental necessity adds a layer of tragic irony. Customers were forced to risk health through contaminated food and violent encounters in a tavern merely to consume the safest available liquid. The food, however, amplified the peril. Tavern cuisine centered around pottage, a thick, constantly simmering stew, the perpetual stew, which could contain virtually anything edible, and quite a few things that weren't. While this offered a hot, filling meal, it was a breeding ground for bacteria and questionable ingredients, including meat that might have died of disease or cuts past their prime. Bread, the other staple, ranged from respectable white loaves to dense, gritty, barely edible versions mixed with sawdust or ground acorns to stretch the flour. The lack of hygiene in preparation, with cross-contamination inevitable and utensils often uncleaned, made every meal a gamble, intensifying the constant threat to survival. The true drama of the medieval tavern sprang from its patrons, a rogues gallery that attracted every stratum of society, interacting on relatively equal and volatile terms. Merchants counting coins, soldiers bearing scars and battle mud, pilgrims seeking escape or adventure, and local craftsmen celebrating commissions filled the dimly lit rooms. The tavern keeper, typically a formidable man of substantial girth and questionable morals, presided over this chaos like a king. His word was law, and his justice, swift and often brutal, established him as part confessor, part loan shark, and part executioner. The constant tension was fueled by the unpredictable social currents. Soldiers, often suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD, brought a casual attitude toward violence, ready to turn a simple disagreement into a bloodbath. Women, whether alewives, serving wenches, or prostitutes, occupied a complex and often dangerous position. But many were equally ruthless, skilled in manipulation, or armed with kitchen implements for self-defense. Even the clergy, who officially condemned the establishments, were surprisingly common patrons, sometimes using their status for less wholly corrupt activities. This dynamic mix meant that a single misunderstood gesture or an ill-timed joke could escalate into deadly violence. The twin engines of tavern drama were gambling and violence. Gambling was not merely entertainment, but a path to social advancement or ruin, attracting victims from every social class. Dice games like hazard were common. Wild affairs where cheating was considered an art form. Players used loaded or shaved dice, and highly skilled professional gamblers, dicers or card sharps, traveled constantly, living off their ability to win without arousing suspicion. The stakes were immense, involving not just money, but honor and reputation. A nobleman losing to a peasant could find his standing permanently damaged. Violence was an integral part of the social fabric, expected and inevitable. It erupted over perceived slights, disputed debts, or sheer intoxication. Since personal honor was paramount, violence was often the only option for maintaining one's place in society. Improvised weapons, knives, wooden stools, heavy pewter tankards were turned into instruments of death in the close, crowded confines of the tavern. The fighting styles were brutal, focused on incapacitating or killing quickly. This raw, life-or-death confrontation provides the ultimate dramatic tension, especially knowing that the medical treatment available for injuries was primitive, often leading to death from infection days or weeks later. Adding further complexity and darkness to the narrative was the role of prostitution, often an integral, tolerated part of the business model despite official condemnation. Prostitutes faced harsh, dangerous conditions, including constant threats of violence, disease, and exploitation. Yet, the most successful among them became more than sexual partners. They were confidants, entertainers, and informants, demonstrating cunning and adaptability. Justice in this realm was a legal gray area, a contradictory system of secular, church, and guild laws. Corruption was rampant. Officials accepted bribes to overlook crimes, or worse, engaged in criminal activities themselves, using their legal authority as cover. The final reckoning for crimes was arbitrary, depending heavily on the social status of the offender. A wealthy merchant might pay a small fine, while a poor peasant could face death for the same offense. The true comprehensive drama of the medieval tavern is revealed in the morning after, when the physical, economic, and psychological toll became apparent. Debts had to be collected, reputations rebuilt, and the psychological effects of constant trauma, though unrecognized at the time, lingered. The tavern survived and thrived because it served an essential function. It provided a space of temporary escape where rigid social rules were suspended and where luck could momentarily triumph over birth and breeding. Ultimately, the medieval tavern offers a profound human story. It was a mirror reflecting the full complexity of the human condition, the capacity for both brutality and community, for creation and destruction. The compelling truth is that these institutions were profoundly human, enduring because they met needs for excitement, connection, and survival in a hostile world. The tale of the tavern is the eternal story of humanity struggling for meaning in chaos, where any stranger might become a friend or an enemy before dawn. Close your eyes now. Let the rigid walls of your own room dissolve into the soft, velvet black of history. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, breathe. Can you feel the shift in the air? We are no longer in the present. We are standing ankle deep in the churned mud of a twilight street in 14th century London, or perhaps York, or a nameless village in the Holy Roman Empire. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and charcoal. Above us, jutting out from a timber-framed building that leans precariously over the alley, is a long wooden pole, the Ailstake. There is no painted sign, no clever name like the Prancing Pony or the King's Head, just yet. Historians tell us that for centuries, a simple bundle of evergreen foliage or a hoop tied to a pole was the universal beacon, a silent promise that a lay was brewing within. The wind bites at your cheeks, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the damp earthiness of the river nearby. Step forward, reach out your hand, and push against the heavy, iron-bound oak door. It resists for a moment, heavy with the weight of the ages, before groaning open on dry hinges. Immediately, the cold night air is replaced by a physical wall of heat. It is not the clean, dry heat of a modern radiator, but a living, breathing warmth, thick with the smell of roasting meat, dried sweat, wet wool, and the sweet, heavy tang of yeast. The darkness inside is not empty. It is textured. Shadows dance wildly against the plaster walls, thrown by the flicker of tallow candles and the roaring central hearth. You are unseen here, a ghost in the corner, safe to watch, safe to listen. The roar of voices washes over you, a chaotic symphony of laughter, shouting, and the clatter of pewter on wood. This is the threshold. You have left the orderly world behind. Here, in the dim amber glow, the rules are different, written in spilled ale and whispered secrets. Welcome to the tavern. As we step fully away from the door and let it thump shut behind us, sealing out the damp night, the first thing that claims you is not the noise, but the air itself. In the modern world, we are accustomed to invisible air, neutral and odorless. But here, the atmosphere is a physical weight, a living entity that you must push through like wading through deep water. You take a breath and you taste the room before you see it. It is a thick, textured inhalation, a fug, as the locals might call it, composed of 1,000 mingling ghosts. There is the sharp, resinous bite of wood smoke that refuses to leave, clinging to the rafters like a grey blanket. And beneath that, the heavy, greasy sweetness of roasting meat turning on a spit. Mingled in is the scent of drying wool, wet dogs, and the undeniable, yeasty perfume of fermentation that seeps from the very wood of the barrels. It is an olfactory map of survival. Your eyes sting gently, a sensation that every person in this room accepts as the price of warmth. In the center of the room, or perhaps against a soot-blackened wall, If this is a newer establishment, the hearth roars. This is the heart of the tavern, the only source of heat in a world where winter could kill as surely as a sword. But distinct from the clean-burning gas fires of the future, this fire breathes. It consumes oxygen voraciously, competing with the 50 souls packed onto the benches. Historians and archaeologists still argue over the precise timeline of the chimney revolution in common dwellings. While castles had stone flues to carry smoke away, your average roadside tavern in the 14th century likely still relied on a central open hearth with a simple louvre, a hole in the roof covered by a slatted lantern to let the smoke escape. Often, the smoke, having no interest in the laws of thermodynamics, prefers to hover right at eye level, creating a blue-gray strata that separates the room. To stand up is to have your head in the clouds, quite literally, while to sit is to inhabit a slightly clearer, albeit cooler, microclimate. The patrons have adapted to this. You notice they move with a slight hunch, keeping low, their movements economical to conserve breath. The lighting is low, dramatic, and fiercely expensive. There are no bright overheads here, only the chiaroscuro lighting of reality, pools of warm gold surrounded by abyssal shadows. The light comes from rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat, clamped in iron holders, burning with a sputter and a smell that reminds you uncomfortably of frying bacon. If the landlord is wealthy, there might be tallow candles made from rendered mutton fat, which droop in the heat and offer a smoky yellow glow. Beeswax candles, with their clean flame and honey scent, are reserved for the church and the nobility. Here, the light smells of the pasture. It casts long dancing shadows that make the room feel larger, more mysterious, as if the corners stretch out into infinity. In these shadows, deals are struck and hands brush against hands, the darkness providing a privacy that the crowded benches do not. But look down. The ground beneath your feet is not wood nor stone, but a strange, spongy carpet that yields softly under your weight. This is the floor of rushes. In an age before vacuum cleaners or easy sanitation, the solution to a dirty floor was simply to cover it up. Fresh green rushes from the riverbank, or perhaps straw from the threshing floor, are strewn across the packed earth to provide insulation and absorb spills. It sounds rustic and charming, perhaps smelling of cut grass when first laid down. However, the truth is far deeper, literally. As the weeks turn to months, layers of debris accumulate. A spilled ale, a dropped chicken bone, the mud from 100 boots, it all vanishes into the rushes. Instead of sweeping the old layer out, a lazy tavern keeper simply scatters fresh rushes over the top, creating a geological record of the tavern's history. The famous scholar Erasmus, writing a bit later in history, but capturing the essence of this medieval practice, complained vividly about English floors, noting that the bottom layers often remained undisturbed for 20 years, harboring what he politely termed ancient collections of filth. It is a living ecosystem under your boots. To mask the inevitable odor of this decomposing history, the more fastidious landlords would sprinkle sweet-smelling herbs among the straw, meadowsweet, lavender, and woodruff. As you walk, the crushing of these dried herbs releases faint, ghostly puffs of floral scent that battle valiantly against the smoke and the sweat, a tiny aromatic war waged beneath the tables. This floor is treacherous in its own way. It hides lost coins, dropped daggers, and the occasional sleeping patron Who has slid from the bench to find a soft, rustling bed? The walls that box us in are close, constructed of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and manure that dries into a surprisingly distinct, rock-hard plaster. They are coated in whitewash, or at least they were once. Now, they are stained tobacco brown and charcoal black, absorbing the stories and the soot of decades. There are no glass windows to look out of. Glass is a luxury for cathedrals and kings. Instead, small openings are covered with oilcloth or wooden shutters, barred tight against the night. This reinforces the feeling of being in a capsule, a ship sailing through the dark ocean of the medieval night. The isolation is total. Inside these walls, the king's law feels distant and the church's commandments slightly flexible. The atmosphere is cozy, yes, but it is a claustrophobic cozy, a warmth born of necessity and crowded bodies. You can feel the moisture in the air, the collective exhalation of the crowd misting on the cold iron of the door hinges. It is a respiratory intimacy that we have lost in our sterilized age. Every breath you take here contains the breath of the soldier to your left, the merchant to your right, and the minstrel tuning his lute in the corner. You are sharing their air, their warmth, and their microbes. It is a biological communion that binds the room together. And yet, there is a strange comfort in it. The smoke, for all its stinging, acts as a preservative, curing the timbers and perhaps even the lungs of the patrons. Or so they might jokingly tell themselves to excuse the cough that rattles in every chest. It softens the edges of reality. In this haze, a scarred mercenary looks like a weary hero. A tired barmaid looks like a radiant beauty. The smoke is the tavern's natural filter, blurring the harsh lines of a brutal world into something softer, something bearable. It creates a dreamlike suspension of time. You watch a puff of grey drift lazily up toward the blackened beams of the ceiling, joining the cloud that has hovered there since the Plantagenets took the throne. It is quiet for a moment, a lull in the roar, and you realize that your throat is parched. The smoke has done its work. It has dried you out, rasping against your palate, demanding to be washed away. The sensory assault of the air has created a biological imperative. You don't just want a drink. Your body is screaming for liquid to scrub the soot from your throat. In a modern bar, you might ask for a glass of water. But here, in the year 1350, that request would be met with confused stares, or perhaps a look of horror. To drink water is to invite death, or at the very least, a chaotic disruption of the bowels that this room is ill-equipped to handle. No, to survive the air, you must turn to the only safe harbor available. You look toward the large, sweating barrels behind the counter where the tapster stands ready. The air has set the stage, drying you out, preparing you for the most fundamental, caloric, and dangerous relationship the medieval person had. The relationship with their ale. The smoke swirls, parting like a curtain, as we turn our attention to the mugs being filled with a golden, murky liquid that is so much more than a beverage. It is the fuel of the era. The vessel is placed before you with a heavy, satisfying thud, a rough-hewn wooden tankard, or perhaps, if the establishment is prosperous, a blackjack made of leather coated in tar, or even dull, dented pewter that feels cool and slick against your palm. You lift it, and the liquid inside sloshes heavily. It is not the crystal-clear, effervescent lager of a modern commercial, sparkling with artificial carbonation. This is medieval ale, and it is a meal in a glass. It is opaque, a murky, brownish-gold suspension that looks less like a beverage and more like a very thin soup. If you look closely in the dim rushlight, you might see small particulates floating in the depths, yeast, husks of grain, or herbs used for flavoring. To the modern eye, it might look suspicious, a cloudy puddle of uncertainty. But to the medieval patron sitting beside you, wiping the foam from his beard, this cloudy liquid is the elixir of life, the only barrier standing between him and a violently early grave. In the 14th century, the relationship between humanity and water was one of deep, terrifying mistrust. Water was not a source of purity. It was a delivery system for death. In the crowded, unplanned sprawl of a medieval town, the river served a dual purpose that is horrifying to modern sensibilities. It was both the sewer and the well. Tanners washed their toxic hides in it. Butchers dumped offal into the current, and chamber pots were emptied into the gutters that fed the stream. To drink a cup of unboiled water was to play a game of Russian roulette with dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, though the people of the time did not know the names of these invisible killers. They only knew that water could cause the bloody flux and wring the life out of a man in days. Ale, therefore, was the technological solution to a biological problem. The magic lay in the brewing. To make ale, the water had to be boiled for hours, a process that inadvertently, but miraculously, sterilized it, killing the pathogens that thrived in the cold river. The medieval mind might not have understood the germ theory of disease. They believed illness was carried by miasma or bad air. But they understood cause and effect. They saw that those who drank from the river sickened and died, while those who drank from the barrel lived and worked. Thus, the tavern was not merely a bar. It was a pharmacy, dispensing the preventative medicine of the populace. This reliance on ale created a culture where sobriety was practically unknown, not out of hedonism, but out of hydration. Everyone drank. The toddler taking their first stumbling steps, the pregnant mother, the elderly priest, and the field laborer, all consumed ale from sunrise to sunset. However, it is a historical misconception that everyone was stumbling drunk all the time. The secret lay in the strength of the brew. The tavern offered a hierarchy of potency. For breakfast and daily hydration, there was small beer or penny ale, made from the second or third running of the grain. It was low in alcohol, perhaps only 1 to 2%, just enough to keep the water sterile and provide a mild buzz, but weak enough to allow a mason to carve stone or a ploughman to cut a straight furrow without toppling over. But here, in the evening shadows of the tavern, the double ale or stout ale flows. This is the strong stuff, brewed from the first mash, rich in sugar and alcohol, designed to cloud the mind and ease the aches of a hard life. The taste is shocking to a modern palate accustomed to the bitter bite of hops. For much of the medieval period, hops were a controversial, foreign novelty from the Low Countries. Instead, English ale was flavored with gruit, a secret proprietary blend of herbs that might include bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, or ground ivy. The resulting flavor is sweet, heavy, and earthy, with a botanical tang that sits thick on the tongue. It is less refreshing than it is nourishing. In fact, it was known as liquid bread, a single gallon of ale, a standard daily ration for a monk or a laborer, contained a massive amount of calories, providing the fuel necessary to keep a body warm and moving in a world without central heating or labor-saving devices. When you drink this ale, You are not just getting drunk, you are consuming the grain harvest in its most efficient preservable form. As you take a sip, the thick, sweet liquid coats your throat, washing away the acrid taste of the smoke. It is comforting, warm, and filling. You can feel the calories hitting your blood, a surge of energy that wakes up the tired mind. But there is a scholarly debate that whispers through the history of this tankard. Historians still argue vigorously about the exact transition from ale, unhopped, to beer, hopped, and how it changed the social landscape. Some suggest that the introduction of hops, which acted as a preservative, allowing beer to be stored longer and shipped further, eventually killed the small local alewife economy in favor of larger, male-dominated commercial breweries. But here in our candlelit moment, that industrial future is far away. Here, the ale is likely brewed in the back room by the tavern keeper's wife, made fresh this week, intended to be drunk this week. It is a hyper-local product, tasting of the specific water of this village and the specific herbs gathered from the nearby woods. It is intimate. You set the tankard down, leaving a wet ring on the scarred oak table. The drink has soothed your thirst, but it has awakened something else. The yeast and the sugar have sparked a fire in your belly, a hunger that sudden alcohol often brings. The smell of the roasting meat we noticed earlier becomes sharper, more demanding. You realize you haven't eaten, and in a medieval tavern, that realization is the beginning of a whole new adventure. You look towards the fire, where a large black iron cauldron hangs from a hook, bubbling sluggishly like a tar pit. This is the heart of the tavern's kitchen, the vessel that never sleeps, the culinary mystery that has been feeding and occasionally poisoning patrons for years. It is time to peer into the pot. Lean in closer to the hearth, but be careful not to singe your cloak, for the heat radiating from the fire is fierce, a necessary violence to combat the drafty chill of the room. Dominating the flames, suspended by a heavy, blackened chain from the chimney beam, hangs the cauldron. It is the altar of the tavern, the black iron belly that feeds the room, and it holds a substance that defies modern culinary categorization. This is the home of the perpetual stew, or pottage, a dish that exists outside the normal laws of time. In a modern kitchen, a meal has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is prepared, cooked, and served. Here, the stew is a continuous living entity. It was not made today. It was likely started days, perhaps weeks ago, and has been evolving ever since. The principle is one of ruthless efficiency. The pot is rarely emptied and scrubbed. Instead, as the hungry patrons deplete the contents, the tavern keeper or his wife simply adds more liquid, water, ale, or broth, and tosses in whatever ingredients are available that day. A handful of withered carrots, a few onions, a cabbage that has seen better days, a hunk of salted pork, or a trapped hare. The new ingredients float at the top, crisp and distinct, while the older ingredients sink, disintegrating into a thick, brown sludge at the bottom. To eat from this pot is to act as an archaeologist of the tavern's recent history. A single ladle might contain a turnip thrown in this morning, and the ghost of a mutton bone from last Tuesday. It bubbles sluggishly, a thick, viscous popping sound that suggests a density closer to lava than soup. The smell is overpowering, a dense, savory wall of boiled cabbage, salty meat, and onions, comfortable and nauseating in equal measure. There is a standing joke among the peasantry that a good pottage should be thick enough to hold a spoon upright without it leaning against the side. If the spoon sinks, the landlord is cheating you on the vegetables. But beneath this rustic charm lies a game of biological roulette. In the era before refrigeration, the safety of this perpetual cooking method relied entirely on the fire never going out. As long as the stew was kept at a simmer, the heat was sufficient to kill the bacteria that swarmed in the ingredients. But fuel was expensive, and wood had to be chopped or bought. In the quiet, dead hours of the early morning, when the tavern emptied and the keeper slept, the fire would die down to embers. The great iron pot would cool, dropping into the danger zone, that tepid temperature range where bacteria do not die, but thrive, multiplying with joyous, microscopic speed in the nutrient-rich broth. Then, come morning, the fire would be stoked, the stew reheated, and the cycle would continue. The boiling might kill the bacteria, but it did not always neutralize the toxins they left behind. Thus, a bowl of pottage could be piping hot, delicious, and completely toxic. It is a testament to the iron constitutions of our ancestors that they survived this daily dietary gamble. The ingredients themselves tell a story of social stratification. If you look into the bubbling depths, you will see very little fresh meat. Fresh meat was a luxury for the rich who owned the land and the game upon it. For the tavern patron, the meat was almost exclusively preserved, salted, smoked, or pickled to within an inch of its life. You might find bacon in the pot, but not the crisp pink strips of a modern breakfast. This was fatty, grey, incredibly salty pork that had hung in a chimney for months, hard as wood, until boiled into submission. There might be stockfish, dried cod that had to be beaten with a hammer before it could be cooked. The overwhelming taste of the stew, therefore, is salt. It is an aggressive, mouth-puckering saltiness that masks the flavor of any vegetable that might be slightly turned. And this, of course, is a brilliant economic loop for the landlord. The saltier the stew, the thirstier the patron, the thirstier the patron, the more ale they buy. It is a closed system of commerce engineered to extract the maximum coinage from your purse. Scholarly debate adds a layer of mystery to the pot. Historians still argue about how strictly religious dietary laws were followed in these rough establishments. Technically, on lean days, Fridays, Saturdays, and throughout Lent, eating meat was forbidden by the church. The pot should, by law, contain only fish or vegetables. But in the dim, smoky chaos of a tavern, who was checking? Did the landlord fish out the pork chunks on a Friday? Or did he simply stir them to the bottom and serve the vegetable top layer to the pious, winking at the regulars who knew better? The archaeological evidence of animal bones found in tavern middens suggests a pragmatic, rather than dogmatic, approach to the menu. As you watch, the tavern keeper approaches the fire, a large stained wooden ladle in hand. He looks like a wizard tending a cauldron of potions, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the embers. He stirs the mixture, a heavy rowing motion that brings the bottom sediment swirling to the top. The aroma intensifies, heavy with garlic, and leaks the poor man's medicine. He scoops up a serving. It lands with a wet flop into the vessel, waiting to receive it. And here we encounter the next challenge of the meal. There are no ceramic plates here. They are too fragile and expensive for a rowdy tavern. There are no delicate china bowls. The vessel for this stew is often not a bowl at all, but a piece of culinary architecture that serves as plate, napkin, and eventual food source all in one. The hot, brown sludge is poured onto a slab of bread. But this is not bread as you know it. This is the trencher, a dense, stale, flat loaf that forms the foundation of the medieval table. It acts as an edible barrier between the sticky table and the sticky food. The steam rises from the trencher, softening the hard crust, melding the stew and the bread into a single, soggy unity. Your stomach rumbles, overriding your modern knowledge of hygiene. The primal smell of cooked fat and onions triggers a deep, evolutionary response. You are hungry, and in this room, hunger is the only source you need. You reach out, ready to tear into the meal, but as your hand touches the rough texture of the bread, you pause. You are holding the other half of the medieval diet, the staff of life that supports the entire feudal system. But just like the stew, the bread is not what it seems. It holds its own secrets, its own hierarchy, and its own hidden dangers that can drive a man to madness. We must break this bread and look inside. The trencher beneath your stew is not merely a vessel. It is a map of the social order, baked into a crust, a tangible symbol of where you stand in the great chain of being. As you tear off a chunk of the bread, careful to catch the dripping gravy, you are holding the most politically charged substance in the medieval world. In the dim light of the tavern, bread is not uniform. It is a spectrum of color and texture that dictates your worth. If you were a duke or a bishop dining in a high hall, your bread would be manchet, a small, pristine loaf of the finest wheat, sifted twice through woolen cloths until it was snowy white and soft as a cloud. But here, in the smoky embrace of the tavern, manchet is a rumor, a ghost story told by hungry men. What you hold in your hand is likely maslin, a speckled, hearty mix of rye and wheat. Or perhaps, if the harvest was poor, horse bread. The latter is exactly what it sounds like. A dense, brick-heavy loaf made from dried peas, beans, and oats, originally intended for stable animals, but consumed by the poor when the grain silos ran empty. It is dark, heavy, and tastes of the earth itself, requiring a strong jaw and a determined spirit to chew. The texture is gritty, and this is not a culinary flaw, but a geological fact. The flour for this bread was ground between massive stones at the local mill, stones that slowly pulverized each other along with the grain. Over time, fine dust and grit from the millstones became an inseparable part of the flour. As you chew, you might feel a phantom crunch, the sound of stone against enamel. This is the slow, grinding reality of medieval life. Archaeologists studying the skulls of the period often find teeth worn down to smooth nubs, the enamel scoured away by a lifetime of eating stone dust bread. Every meal was a micro-abrasion, a slow erosion of the body in the service of survival. But the danger of bread went deeper than simple wear and tear. The tavern patron had to possess a deep, cynical trust in the baker, a trust that was often misplaced. In a world without food, safety standards, the loaf was a black box of potential deception. Bakers were notorious figures of suspicion, frequently accused of adulterating their dough to increase profits. If the wheat was expensive, why not bulk up the flour with a little sawdust? If the bread looked too dark and unappealing, why not bleach it with a handful of ground chalk or alum to mimic the expensive white loaves of the nobility? There were even whispers of bakers using cobwebs or crowned bones to stretch the mix. The crown took this threat so seriously that the assize of bread and ale was established. a strict law regulating the weight and price of loaves. A baker caught selling light or tainted bread faced public humiliation, often being dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf tied around his neck like a heavy, yeasty albatross. Yet, in the shadows of the tavern, far from the eyes of the assize inspectors, you eat what you are given. You dip the crust into the pottage, softening the stone-hard exterior, and take the risk. There is, however, a darker shadow lurking in the rye, a danger that no amount of laws could police because it was invisible. In wet, cold summers, a fungus known as ergot could infect the rye crops. To the naked eye, it looked like black spurs on the grain, easily ground up into the dark flour used for tavern bread. But when baked and eaten, ergot unleashed a chemical nightmare. It contains alkaloids similar to LSD. A patron who consumed a bad loaf might not just get a stomach ache, they might succumb to St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms were horrific and terrifyingly psychedelic. A burning sensation in the limbs, as if the blood were turning to lava, violent convulsions, and vivid, hellish hallucinations. A tavern brawl might not start because of a gambling dispute, but because a man, poisoned by his own dinner, suddenly saw demons crawling out of the shadows, or believed his neighbor's face had melted into a monster's mask. Historians still argue about how many outbreaks of mass hysteria, bewitchment, or dancing manias in the medieval period were actually just entire villages tripping violently on contaminated toast. It adds a layer of psychological horror to the meal. The bread could feed you, or it could break your mind. But let us assume tonight's loaf is safe, merely gritty and tough. As the meal progresses, the trencher serves its final purpose. It has soaked up the juices of the stew, becoming a savory, gravy-laden prize in itself. In a noble house, these sodden trenchers would be collected by servants and distributed to the poor at the gates as alms. But here, in the pragmatic economy of the tavern, nothing is wasted. You watch the man across from you finish his stew, then pick up his plate, the trencher, and eat it. It is the original edible packaging, a zero-waste solution born of scarcity. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, the grease gleaming in the candlelight, satisfied and heavy with carbohydrates. The immediate gnawing hunger is gone, replaced by the lethargy of digestion. The room seems to settle, the roar of conversation dipping slightly as bellies are filled. But this calm is deceptive. The tavern is not a democracy, it is a kingdom, and every kingdom has a ruler. As the serving wenches clear the few wooden bowls and wipe the tables with rags that have seen better decades, a hush ripples through the room, starting near the back and moving forward like a wave. A door bangs open, not the front door, but a heavy interior door leading to the private quarters. A figure emerges, framed by the light of the kitchen fires behind him. He is a man of significant mass, his size a walking advertisement for the quality of his own product. He moves with a surprising heavy grace, his eyes scanning the room, not with the warmth of a host, but with the calculation of a predator counting his herd. This is the ale corner, the host, the landlord, the absolute monarch of this smoky domain. He is the bank, the police force, and the judge of the tavern, and he is coming to collect. To understand the tavern, you must understand the man who holds the keys, for his personality dictates whether this night ends in song or in blood. He steps into the light, a heavy bunch of iron keys jingling at his belt, like a jailer's chimes, and the atmosphere tightens. The true business of the night is about to begin. The figure standing before the hearth is not the jovial, rosy-cheeked innkeeper of a children's storybook, wiping a clean glass with a smile. Dismiss that image entirely. The man commanding the room, let's call him Master Watt, is a creature of grim necessity, a heavy-set fortress of a man whose very silhouette blocks the light of the fire. In the medieval tavern, the landlord was less of a host and more of a warden. He had to be. He stands with feet planted wide, his boots caked with the same muck as his patrons, but of better leather. His apron stained with the geography of 1,000 spills, ale, blood, grease, and wine, is a badge of office, a canvas of the chaos he manages nightly. He does not smile, for smiling suggests weakness, and in this room, weakness is a scent that attracts wolves. He is the keeper of the chaos, a man who balances the delicate equation of keeping patrons drunk enough to spend, but sober enough not to burn the building down. His authority is absolute, derived not from a crown or a bishop's mitre, but from the heavy cudgel of blackthorn wood that hangs loosely at his belt, right next to the jingling keys. This cudgel is not decorative. In a society where the police force was practically non-existent, consisting perhaps of a drowsy night watchman who avoided trouble at all costs, the tavern keeper was the sole arbiter of law and order within these walls. He was the bouncer, the judge, and the executioner of the tavern peace. If a fight broke out, he did not call the guards. He ended it, usually with a swift, brutal application of physics to the skull. There is a palpable tension as he moves through the room, his eyes flicking over the crowd, counting heads and calculating risks. He knows who is carrying a hidden dagger, who has drunk past their limit, and who is likely to try and slip away without paying. This paranoia is not merely a personality quirk. It is a legal requirement, a fascinating and harsh reality of medieval common law was the concept of strict liability for innkeepers. If a guest's horse was stolen from the stable, or their cloak lifted from a peg while they slept, the landlord was often held financially responsible, regardless of whether he was involved. The law assumed that, if a theft occurred, the landlord was either incompetent or an accomplice. Thus, Master Watt's suspicious glare is a form of insurance policy. He watches you not because he cares for your safety, but because your safety is directly tied to his profit margin. He is trapped in a high-stakes game where every stranger is a potential liability, but his role extends far beyond security. He is the financial hub of the village. In a world without banks, ATMs, or credit cards, the tavern keeper is the unofficial banker of the working class. Watch as he moves behind the sturdy oak counter, a defensive fortification in its own right. A patron approaches, a dusty traveler short on coin, but rich in promises. Master Watt does not reach for a ledger and a quill, for paper is expensive and literacy is rare. Instead, he reaches for a piece of hazel wood, the tally stick. This is the credit card of the Middle Ages. With a small knife, he carves notches into the wood across the width of the stick. One notch for a pint, deeper notches for a meal or a bed. Then, in a moment of brilliant, primitive cryptography, he splits the stick down the middle, lengthwise. He gives one half to the debtor and keeps the other half himself. The unique grain of the wood and the specific placement of the notches act as a perfect, unforgeable key. When the traveler returns to pay his debt, The two halves must match perfectly. It is a system of beautiful simplicity, and looking at the bundle of split sticks hanging behind the bar, you realize the landlord holds the debt of half the town. He owns their thirst, and by extension, he owns them. This economic power grants him a strange, ambiguous social status. Scholarly debate still circles around the figure of the medieval ale seller. Were they respected pillars of the community or pariahs of the underworld? The records show a schizophrenic truth. On one hand, tavern keepers were often elected to local offices, serving as ale corners, inspectors, or church wardens, trusted with communal funds. On the other hand, they were constantly fined by the courts for breaking the assize, selling weak beer, using false measures, or allowing gambling. It seems the successful landlord lived comfortably in the grey zone, a necessary evil who greased the wheels of society with ale and usury. Master Watt is likely a master of blending, a polite term for the art of mixing the dregs of old barrels with fresh ale to stretch the supply, or perhaps adding a splash of vinegar and spices to wine that has turned sour, selling it as a rare vintage from Gascony. He serves it with a flat stare that dares you to complain. His relationship with the church is equally complex. While the local priest might thunder against the tavern as the devil's chapel from the pulpit on Sunday morning, that same priest is likely sitting in the corner on Tuesday evening, sipping the very vice he condemned. The landlord knows everyone's secrets. He knows which merchant is cheating on his guild, which wife is meeting a lover, and which soldier is hiding from the king's muster. This knowledge is his true currency, more valuable than the silver groats locked in his strongbox. He trades in silence and information. As he wipes the counter with a rag that is stiff with dried ale, you notice his hands. They are scarred and thick, the knuckles swollen. These are hands that have thrown drunkards into the mud and counted millions of pennies. He pauses, his gaze locking onto a group of young men near the door who are getting too loud, their laughter edging into aggression. He doesn't shout. He simply stops moving. The sudden stillness of such a large man is louder than a scream. He picks up the cudgel, just lifting it an inch off the counter and letting it drop with a heavy wooden talk. The sound cuts through the noise. The young men look up, see the look in his eyes, a look of bored, inevitable violence, and the volume drops instantly. Order is restored, not by law, but by the threat of immediate blunt force trauma. He is the gravity that holds the room together. Without him, the tavern would explode into anarchy. With him, it is a controlled explosion, a pressure cooker where the steam is released one pint at a time. He turns his back to the room to tap a new barrel, a gesture of supreme confidence. He knows the room is his. But who exactly is he ruling over? As Master Watt fades back into the shadows of the bar, satisfied with his dominion, we turn our eyes to the floor, to the benches, and to the chaotic sea of humanity that has washed up in this dark harbor. The tavern is a magnet for the displaced, the ambitious, and the desperate. It is time to meet the patrons, the rogues gallery of the medieval world, and understand why they have all gathered here, shoulder to shoulder, in the dark. Turn your gaze now from the formidable silhouette of the landlord and let it drift across the crowded benches. In the flickering amber light, the room reveals itself as a rare and volatile chemical experiment, the mixing of elements that, in the rigid hierarchy of the outside world, are kept strictly apart. The medieval tavern is the great leveler, the one place where the strict stratification of feudal society begins to blur and bleed at the edges. Here, the three estates, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, find themselves rubbing elbows, sharing the same stale air and the same bench. It is a gathering of rogues, travelers, and dreamers, a tableau vivant of humanity in motion. In the corner, closest to the fire, but guarding his space with a fortress of skepticism, sits the merchant. You can identify him by the anxiety in his shoulders and the quality of his cloak. Perhaps a wool dyed in a rich, deep madder red or woad blue, hinting at wealth without explicitly violating the sumptuary laws that forbid commoners from wearing the purple of nobility. He is a man of the road, a creature of commerce in a world that makes commerce incredibly difficult. He is likely traveling to a fair in Stourbridge or Champagne, his back heavy, with samples of cloth, spices, or pewter. To him, the tavern is not a place of leisure. It is a terrifying necessity. The roads outside are plagued by brigands and outlaws, men literally outside the protection of the law, making the tavern the only fortified island in a sea of danger. Watch his hands. He keeps one hand protectively near his belt, where his purse hangs, while the other clutches his tankard. He is scanning the room, not for friends, but for potential business partners or potential threats. He represents the rising middle class, a group that is slowly, quietly dismantling the feudal system with the power of coin rather than the sword. He is tired, his boots worn from the miles, but his mind is racing with exchange rates and the price of wool. Sitting uncomfortably close to the merchant is a group that brings a riot of color and noise to the gloom: the pilgrims. If you imagined pilgrims as solemn, silent figures marching toward salvation with heads bowed, dismiss that image. In the 14th century, pilgrimage was the medieval equivalent of the package holiday. While their destination is holy, perhaps the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury or the remote holy well of Walsingham, their journey is often a raucous escape from the drudgery of daily life. They are the tourists of the Middle Ages. They wear their travel badges like souvenirs on their hats, lead pins cast in the shape of saints or religious symbols, proof of where they have been, collected like stamps in a passport. But tonight, their piety is on pause. They are drinking deeply, singing songs that are decidedly secular, and sharing tales of the road. Historians have long debated the true nature of medieval pilgrimage, noting that for many, especially women, it was the only socially acceptable excuse to leave the house, travel the world, and have an adventure. The tavern is their hostel, their release. You can hear their laughter rising above the din, a mix of genuine religious fervor and the sheer relief of being away from the watchful eyes of their village priest and neighbors. Drifting through the crowd like smoke is a figure who belongs to neither the merchants nor the pilgrims, though he mimics them perfectly. This is the professional vagabond, the sturdy beggar, or perhaps a darker specialist, the cutpurse. In an era before pockets were sewn into trousers, men and women carried their coins in leather pouches tied to their belts with thongs. The cutpurse is an artist of the blade. He carries a small razor-sharp knife, a nip, concealed in his palm. He moves with a liquid grace, bumping into a distracted drinker, creating a momentary confusion. In that split second of contact, the knife flicks, the thong is severed, and the purse drops silently into his hand. It is a ballet of theft performed in the dark. The victim will not notice the lightness at his hip until it is time to pay the reckoning, leading to a frantic, hopeless search of the rushes, while the thief has long since vanished into the night. This shadow economy is as much a part of the tavern as the ale itself. Where money gathers, predators follow. But the bulk of the room is filled with the locals, the craftsmen and laborers, for whom the tavern is an extension of their living room. In the cramped, cold tenements of a medieval town where a whole family might share a single room with their livestock, the tavern offers space, heat, and light. Here are the weavers with their stained fingertips, the smiths with their singed eyebrows, and the apprentices who have slipped away from their masters for a forbidden pint. They are the engine of the town, loud and brash. They are arguing about guild politics, complaining about the price of grain, and gossiping about the scandals of the highborn. Listening to them, you realize that the tavern is the newsfeed of the era. Before newspapers or radio, if you wanted to know if the king was sick, if a war was starting, or if the plague was moving closer, you came here. Rumor travels faster than a horse, and the tavern is the amplifier. Yet, there is a scholarly nuance to this crowd that is often overlooked. We tend to think of medieval peasants as static, born and dying in the same village, never seeing the world. But recent analysis of court rolls and tax records suggests a population in constant, restless motion. The Black Death of the mid-14th century shattered the old labor laws. Suddenly, workers were scarce and valuable. They moved for better wages, defying the laws that tried to tie them to the land. The tavern was the node where these wandering workers connected, exchanged tips on which lord was paying the best wages, and plotted their next move. The room is not just full of locals, it is full of migrants, a dynamic, shifting workforce seeking a better life. However, the mixing of these groups, the anxious merchant, the rowdy pilgrim, the cunning thief, and the emboldened laborer, creates a tension that hums in the air like a plucked bowstring. Social codes are fragile here. A drunken apprentice might insult a merchant. A pilgrim might stumble into a local hardman. The usual buffers of society are dissolved by the solvent of ale. You can feel the energy in the room, a jagged, unpredictable current. It is not necessarily hostile, but it is charged. Every laugh feels a little too loud, every gesture a little too wide. It is a room full of people who are tired, hungry, and intoxicated, all carrying the invisible burdens of a hard life. And then, your eyes land on a figure sitting slightly apart, perhaps with his back to the wall, a position of tactical habit. He is not loud like the apprentices, nor anxious like the merchant. He is still. He wears a padded gambeson that has seen better days, stained with rust and old earth, and perhaps a piece of chainmail clinks at his throat. A sword, or a long dagger known as a bollock dagger, rests easily within his reach. This is the soldier, the man of war returned to the peace, and he brings a different kind of darkness into the room. He is the element that turns the tavern from a chaotic party into a potential battlefield. As we focus on him, we must understand that he is not just a customer. He is a walking scar of the era's endless conflicts, and he is about to change the mood of the night entirely. The soldier sits in the penumbra of the hearth's glow, his presence a heavy, leaden weight that the boisterous laughter of the pilgrims seems to bend around. He is a veteran of the long grinding wars in France, or perhaps the border skirmishes of the North, and he carries the 100 Years' War in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. To the modern eye, he is a figure of tragic complexity, a man suffering from what we now term PTSD. But in the 14th century, he is simply man of arms, a professional of violence. His gear is a mixture of utility and survival. A thick quilted jack of linen, reinforced with hidden plates of horn or iron, and a hood pulled low to shadow eyes that have seen the walls of Caen fall and the fields of Crécy turn to a red mire. He is a reminder that the medieval world was one of constant, low-level mobilization. Historians still argue whether these returning soldiers were the primary drivers of tavern instability or merely convenient scapegoats for a nervous clergy. However, the court records of the time are littered with men of war who found the transition from the siege line to the ale bench impossible to navigate. For him, the tavern is not a place of relaxation, but a sensory minefield. The sudden bang of a shutter is a splintering shield. The smell of roasting pork is the scent of a burnt village. He drinks not for the flavor, but for the silence it brings to his mind. He consumes the strongest double ale Master Watt provides. Yet he does not seem drunk, only more focused, his gaze never leaving the door. This soldier represents the mercenary nature of the era, a time when loyalty was often a matter of contract and coin. He may be a longbowman, a commoner who rose to status through the lethality of his craft, or a man-at-arms who lost his lord and his lands. Around him, the air feels thinner. The other patrons give him a wide berth, a natural instinct for self-preservation that transcends the social leveling of the alehouse. They know that his sword arm is a finely tuned instrument of reflex. In the close quarters of the tavern, where a man might be pressed chest to chest with a stranger, the soldier's personal space is a sanctuary of iron. If you look closely, you can see the white lines of old scars crossing his knuckles, the calligraphy of a violent life. He is a physical manifestation of the era's volatility, a living weapon resting in a room full of flammable tempers. But he is not the only one who navigates the tavern with a tactical mind. As the soldier stares into the depths of his dark ale, a woman moves through the crowd, her presence as sharp and necessary as a needle. She is the alewife's assistant, or perhaps the alewife herself, and she is the true pivot upon which the tavern's economy turns. While the landlord might hold the cudgel, the women of the tavern hold the keys to the cellar and the secrets of the mashtun. There is a common myth that medieval women were entirely domestic, shut away from the public sphere. But the truth of the tavern shattered this image. Brewing was, for centuries, women's work, a domestic craft that expanded into a commercial powerhouse. She moves with a practiced indifference to the grabby hands of drunken clerks or the territorial growls of soldiers. She is armed with a quick wit, a heavy wooden tray, and a sharp, cynical understanding of human nature. Historians note that alewives were often the most independent women in the village, frequently single or widowed, managing their own finances and legal standing through the production of ale. However, this independence made them targets. They were the subject of countless satirical poems and scolding trials, accused of being gossips or cheats who used false measures to swindle the honest working man. There is a famous medieval poem, The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming, which describes a tavern woman in grotesque, nightmarish detail, reflecting the deep-seated anxiety men felt toward women who controlled the magic of fermentation and the flow of money. To the patrons, she is a provider of life. To the authorities, she is a potential source of sedition and sin. Watch her as she navigates the benches. She knows exactly how to deflect a lewd comment with a devastating insult that brings the whole room to laughter, effectively disarming a potential aggressor with the power of public shame. She is the diplomat of the dark, maintaining a precarious peace through sheer force of personality. The tension between the soldier's silent threat and the alewife's noisy management creates a strange, vibrating equilibrium. But then, the door opens again, and the cold night air cuts through the smoke like a knife. A new figure enters, and the atmosphere shifts once more, this time with a touch of the divine mixed with the deeply profane. A friar, his robes dusty from the road and his tonsure slightly overgrown, steps into the light. He is not here to preach, and he is not here to save souls. He is here for the same reason everyone else is. The fire is hot, and the ale is cold. The presence of the clergy in the tavern was a constant thorn in the side of the church hierarchy. Statutes were passed again and again, forbidding priests and monks from entering taverns, which were seen as the devil's schoolhouse. But the laws were as effective as trying to stop the tide with a broom. The friar represents the wandering soul of the Middle Ages, a man who lives in the world rather than the cloister, and who knows that the best place to hear the true confessions of a sinful humanity is not the stone box of a church, but the wooden bench of an alehouse. He finds a seat near the soldier, a bold move that speaks to his own worldliness. He orders a pint with a practiced nod to the alewife, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of genuine compassion and weary cynicism. He is a pardonner, or a limiter, perhaps, a man whose job it is to sell the church's forgiveness for a price. In the tavern, he is a superstar of gossip and theology. He can tell you of the miracles in Rome and the latest dirty jokes from the University of Paris in the same breath. He bridges the gap between the holy and the hole in the wall. Looking at him, you realize that the tavern is not the opposite of the church. It is its dark twin. Both are spaces where people seek an escape from the harshness of their lives, one through the promise of a future heaven, the other through the immediate, fermented heaven of the present moment. The room is now a complete microcosm of the 14th century soul. The merchant's greed, the pilgrim's hope, the thief's cunning, the soldier's trauma, the alewife's resilience, and the friar's flexible morality. They are all bound together by the flickering light and the heavy smell of the perpetual stew. The soldier's hand relaxes slightly on the table. The friar's laughter begins to blend with the merchant's complaints. For a brief, shining moment, the tavern peace holds. But it is a fragile thing, built on a foundation of liquid courage and suppressed grievances. The night is deepening, the ale is getting stronger, and in the corner, a set of dice carved from bone are being produced from a leather pouch. The game of hazard is about to begin, and with it, the thin veneer of civilization will start to fray at the edges. Luck is a cruel mistress in the dark, and her arrival always brings the shadow of the blade closer to the light. The rhythm of the room shifts now, the ambient roar of conversation tightening into a focused, rhythmic thrum, centered around a small scarred table in the lee of the stairs. The game has begun. In the medieval tavern, gambling was not merely a pastime. It was a fever, a desperate reach for the hem of Lady Luck's robes in a world where most destinies were fixed at birth. The dice, or bones, are cast onto the wood with a sharp skeletal rattle, a sound that, for many, was the drumbeat of their own ruin. The primary game is hazard, a complex ancestor of craps that could take hours to play and seconds to lose. As you watch, the players lean in, their faces illuminated from below by a single guttering candle, turning their features into a landscape of jagged shadows and sweat. There is the young apprentice, his eyes wide with the frantic hope of winning enough to buy his freedom from his master. The soldier betting the meager conduct money meant to take him home. And the professional dicer, a man whose hands move with a suspicious, oily fluidness. Historians still argue whether gambling was truly the most disruptive force in tavern life, as the church claimed, or if it served as a vital social pressure valve for a population with no hope of social mobility. To the bishops, the dice were the devil's eyes, and every toss was a step toward damnation. But to the man sitting on this bench, the dice are the only things in his life that don't care about his lineage or his lack of land. For a moment, while the bones are in the air, he is equal to a king. This seductive illusion of fairness is what keeps the coins hitting the table. However, the fairness is often a lie. The sturdy beggars and professional rogues of the tavern are masters of Fulhams, loaded dice weighted with drops of lead or quicksilver to ensure they always land on the high numbers. They use shaves, dice where one side is slightly rounded, or bristles, where a tiny invisible hair is embedded in a face to catch on the cloth or the wood and tilt the outcome. Cheating is not just an occasional occurrence. It is a refined art form, a survival strategy in a predatory economy. The tension around the dice table is a microclimate of the tavern's overall volatility. Every main called and every chance rolled is a potential spark for a fire. In the medieval mind, honor was a physical possession, as real as a cloak or a purse. To be cheated was not just a financial loss, it was a spiritual assault. You see a player's hand fly to his belt as a roll goes against him, his eyes narrowing as he looks at the winner. This is the soft, dramatic tension that defines the midnight hours. The air in the room, already heavy with the smell of the perpetual stew, now tastes of iron and adrenaline. The landlord, Master Watt, watches from his post, his hand resting on his blackthorn cudgel. He knows that the line between a high-stakes game and a low-rent bloodbath is thinner than a parchment. But as the dice rattle, we must also look at the women who navigate this masculine chaos, specifically the alewife who manages the flow of the liquid currency. While the men lose their souls to the bones, she is the one who ensures the house remains solvent. There is a deep historical irony in her position. She is the provider of the very substance that fuels this vice. Yet she is often the only person in the room with a clear head and a sharp ledger. She is an alewife, or brewster, a title that carried significant weight. In many towns, women were the primary brewers until the late 14th century, when the Black Death changed the labor market and men began to professionalize and monopolize the trade into guilds. For now, however, she is the queen of the taps. She knows that every win at the dice table means a new round of drinks, and every loss means a debt that she must somehow collect. She moves between the tables, a heavy leather costrel slung over her shoulder. her presence a mix of maternal comfort and cold, hard business. There is a soft humor to be found in her interactions with the regulars. You overhear her rebuffing a drunken clerk who tries to pay for his ale with a relic, a supposed splinter from the true cross that looks suspiciously like a bit of kindling from the woodshed. "Keep your holy wood for your fire, Master Scribe," she says with a dry rasp. "My barrels only open for silver or honest tally sticks." The room erupts in a brief, warm wave of laughter, a reminder that despite the filth and the danger, there is a profound humanity here. The tavern is a place of joliete, a specific medieval kind of merriment that is loud, coarse, and deeply connected to the shared experience of being alive and relatively warm in a cold world. Yet the laughter is always shadowed. Behind the alewife, in the darker recesses of the room where the candlelight fails to reach, there is another economy at play. Prostitution was an integral, if officially condemned, part of the tavern's ecosystem. These women, often referred to by the diminutive and dismissive terms of the era, occupied the most perilous ground of all. They were vulnerable to the violence of the soldiers, the whims of the landlord, and the diseases that were poorly understood but widely feared. Yet, many were more than just victims. The tavern woman was often a formidable strategist, an informant for the local guilds, or a confidant to the merchants. They were the keepers of the town's secrets, navigating a world that offered them no protection but their own wits. The interplay of these forces, the gambler's hope, the landlord's authority, the alewife's pragmatism, and the shadow economy of the flesh, creates a complex, shifting tapestry. As the night deepens, the individual characters begin to blur into a single, breathing organism. The tavern is now a world unto itself, disconnected from the ticking of the cathedral clock or the rising of the moon. It is a crucible where the stresses of medieval life are melted down and reshaped. But the heat is rising. The double ale has done its work, dissolving the inhibitions of the crowd. A dispute over a 3-penny bet at the hazard table is no longer just a dispute. It is becoming a matter of life and death. You see the soldier stand up, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. The sound is like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet room. The dice stop rattling. All eyes turn toward the center of the room. The transition from commerce to conflict is about to happen, and in the close, smoky air of the 14th century, there is nowhere to run. The air in the tavern has reached a state of heavy, saturated suspension, like a storm cloud just before the first bolt of lightning strikes the earth. The soldier remains standing, a dark pillar against the flickering orange of the hearth. Across from him, a local weaver, a man emboldened by 4 pints of double ale and the sting of a lost week's wages, clutches a pair of dice as if they were holy relics. The weaver's face is flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson, his breathing shallow and ragged. In the medieval mind, this isn't just a game of chance. It is a trial by combat, where God or fate has clearly sided with a cheat. The silence that has fallen is not empty. It is a physical pressure, a vacuum that sucks the oxygen out of the room. You can hear the hiss of the green wood in the fire and the distant, rhythmic drip of a leaking barrel in the cellar. This is the sudden flash of steel that every patron has been subconsciously waiting for since they crossed the threshold. Historians still argue whether medieval society was inherently more violent than our own, or if the violence was simply more intimate, performed with the hands and the blade rather than the distant coldness of modern machinery. In a 14th century tavern, there is no safe distance. The tables are bolted to the floor, the benches are crowded, and every man is within arm's reach of his neighbor's throat. The weaver screams a slur, something about the soldier's mother and a French camp follower, and the world breaks. The soldier does not draw his sword. That would be too slow, too formal for this cramped geometry. Instead, he reaches for his bollock dagger, a stout, kidney-shaped weapon designed for close-quarters thrusting. But he is a professional. He uses the heavy, rounded pommel of the dagger like a hammer, slamming it into the weaver's temple with a sickening wet thud. The room explodes. This is not the choreographed, graceful violence of a film. It is a desperate, flailing scramble. The tavern piece is shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Stools are overturned, used not for sitting, but as makeshift shields and clubs. A heavy pewter tankard, still half full of ale, flies through the air, catching a nearby merchant in the teeth with a sound like breaking porcelain. The perpetual stew is forgotten as the table holding it is upended, sending the grey, salty sludge onto the rushes, where it mingles with the spilled ale and the blood of a broken nose. You see the alewife dive behind the bar, not out of fear, but to protect the most valuable thing in the room, the remaining full barrels. She is shouting, her voice a piercing siren over the roar, but she is ignored. In the medieval tavern, once the blood starts to flow, the logic of the street takes over. In the corner, the friar, our man of God, has made a surprisingly agile leap onto a bench, tucking his robes up to avoid the fray. He isn't praying for their souls yet. He is watching with a clinical, almost bored interest. He has seen this 100 times. He knows that the corrupt justice of the morning will be far more interesting than the brawling of the night. Historians note that many tavern fights were actually litigated later in the local manorial court, where the price of a blood wipe, a fine for drawing blood, was a standard and predictable expense for a rowdy citizen. It was a tax on temper. But here, in the heat of the moment, the law is a ghost. The only law is the landlord, Master Watt, who has finally decided that enough is enough. He moves with the inevitability of a collapsing wall. He does not target the soldier or the weaver specifically. He simply clears a path toward the center of the room with his blackthorn cudgel. Thwack! A young apprentice who was about to throw a punch finds his arm suddenly numb and useless. Crack! A bench being used as a ram is splintered by a downward stroke. Watt does not speak. He grunts with the effort, his face a mask of practiced professional fury. He is the executioner of this small, dark kingdom. He grabs the soldier by the collar of his gambeson, a feat of strength that speaks to years of lifting heavy tons, and shoves him toward the door. Out, he rasps, the word low and vibrating with the threat of death. Take your war to the street, or take it to the devil. The soldier, sensing a force of nature that even his training cannot easily overcome, relents. He sheathes his dagger, spits a glob of dark blood into the rushes, and vanishes into the night air. The weaver is left sobbing on the floor, his face a mess of bruises and gravy. Slowly, the roar subsides into a low, jagged murmur. The adrenaline begins to drain away, replaced by the cold realization of the damage done. Patrons begin to right their stools, their movements slow and shaky. The merchant is clutching his mouth, staring in disbelief at a broken tooth in his palm. The mess on the floor is a disaster, a slurry of ale, stew, straw, and human waste that will be cleaned tomorrow by simply throwing fresh rushes over it. There is a grim, soft humor in the aftermath. The friar climbs down from his bench, adjusts his tonsure, and approaches a shaken pilgrim. A vigorous debate on the nature of luck, wouldn't you say? He whispers, his eyes glinting. I believe the soldier won the argument, though the weaver certainly had the last word in the rushes. The pilgrim doesn't laugh. He is too busy checking if his purse is still attached to his belt. He is lucky. The cutpurses were distracted by the fight, or perhaps they were the ones who started it to facilitate their work. In the medieval tavern, every conflict is a distraction for a different kind of crime. The night is now well past its prime. The fire has burned down to a deep, pulsing crimson heart, throwing long skeletal shadows against the wattle and daub walls. The rogues' gallery is battered and diminished. The energy that once felt like a celebration now feels like a hangover in the making. You can feel the collective morning after already settling into the bones of the men and women here. The financial toll is being calculated in the landlord's head. How many broken mugs? How much wasted stew? How much blood-stained straw to replace? This is the shadow economy of the tavern, the cost of a night's release. As the remaining patrons huddle closer to the embers, seeking the last of the warmth, we realize that the tavern has served its primary brutal purpose. It has allowed these people to vent the pressures of their lives in a way that the church and the state never could. It was a violent, filthy, and expensive release, but it was theirs. They are bound together now by a shared secret, a collective trauma of a Tuesday night. But as the silence returns, it is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a wound that is just beginning to sting. The morning will bring the constable, the debt collector, and the headache of the damned. For now, there is only the guttering candle and the smell of cooling fat. The room has settled into a heavy, post-violent lethargy, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sour dampness of spilled ale. The adrenaline that fueled the brawl has evaporated, leaving behind a cold, aching reality. We shift our gaze to the dark corners, where the true cost of the night is calculated, away from the shattered stools and towards the quiet, transactional shadows. Here, we find the shadow economy of the flesh. Prostitution in the medieval tavern was an open secret, a trade conducted in the periphery of the light, often with the tacit approval and financial participation of the landlord. Historians still argue whether these women were primarily victims of a desperate patriarchal system, or if some were independent entrepreneurs navigating the only path to agency available to them. In the legal records of the 14th century, they appear as common women, yet in the tavern, they are the confidants of the powerful and the comfort of the broken. You see a woman sitting in the deep shadow under the stairs, her face obscured by a linen wimple that has seen better days. She is not the glamorous siren of a modern period drama. She is a woman of the earth, her hands calloused and her eyes weary. She watches the room with a predator's patience. To her, the brawl was merely an occupational hazard, a disruption of her work. She knows that once the blood is wiped away, the survivors will seek the solace of the body to drown out the memory of the blade. This economy was so integrated into tavern life that many establishments were essentially brothels with a license to brew. The church thundered against the stews, the bathhouses and taverns where these transactions took place, but the town councils often took a more pragmatic view. They recognized that, as long as the trade was contained within the tavern walls, it could be taxed, monitored, and used as a source of information. These women were the town's living archives. They knew which merchant was funneling guild funds into his mistress's lap, and which knight was selling his armor to pay off a gambling debt. The atmosphere shifts from the sharp violence of the soldier to a soft, heavy intimacy that is equally dangerous. In this era, justice was a fickle and expensive commodity, and the tavern was the place where it was most often subverted. You watch a local official, a beadle, or a constable enter the room. He does not come to make arrests for the earlier violence. Instead, he moves straight to the bar, where Master Watt slides a heavy pewter mug toward him, followed by a small clinking leather pouch. This is the corrupt justice that held the medieval world together. The bribe was not an anomaly. It was the grease that allowed the gears of society to turn without seizing up. The constable is paid to ignore the Fulhams at the dice table and the common women in the corners. He is a participant in the chaos he is sworn to prevent. There is a scholarly debate about the role of these local officials. Were they inherently corrupt, or were they simply underpaid civil servants in a system that expected them to supplement their income through fees? Regardless of the intent, the result in the tavern is a legal vacuum where the highest bidder dictates the law. Looking at the exchange, you realize that the tavern is a place of absolute transparency. There is no pretense of holiness or civic duty here. Everything, honor, law, sex, and salvation, has a price that can be negotiated over a pint of ale. The soft, dramatic tension here is the tension of the deal. The silent calculation in the eyes of the constable as he weighs the weight of the purse against the potential for a scandal. As the night stretches towards the early hours of the morning, the individual stories of the patrons begin to weave together into a single, sorrowful tapestry. The young apprentice who lost his coins to the dice now sits weeping quietly, his head on the sticky table. The merchant who lost a tooth is trying to haggle with the woman under the stairs, his voice a pathetic, whistling rasp. The perpetual stew has finally run dry, leaving only a burnt, salty crust at the bottom of the cauldron. The fire is a heap of white ash and glowing orange eyes. The sensory assault has peaked and is now receding, leaving you with the morning after, before the sun has even risen. You feel the weight of the history in the beams above you. These timbers have soaked up centuries of sweat and smoke. They have heard the same jokes, the same lies, and the same prayers for 1,000 nights. The tavern is a cycle, a machine for processing human misery and turning it into temporary relief. There is a strange, dark humor in the realization that while the world outside changes, kings fall, borders shift, and languages evolve, the tavern remains a constant. A man in 1350 seeks the same things in the dark as a man in 2025: a warm fire, a strong drink, and someone to listen to his troubles, even if that listener is paid for the privilege. But the final reckoning is coming. The landlord is starting to extinguish the candles, one by one, plunging the room into a deeper, more intimate darkness. The tally sticks are being checked against the memories of the night. The debts are being called in. You can hear the scratching of a quill as Master Watt marks the final notches for the evening. This is the moment when the tavern peace truly ends and the harsh light of the social order begins to return. The patrons must soon step back out into the cold, damp reality of a world that does not care about their temporary equality at the ale bench. As we prepare to follow them out into the dawn, we take one last look at the room. It is a wreck. It is a monument to the filthy truth of the human condition. It is beautiful in its ugliness. A place where the pretense of civilization is stripped away to reveal the raw, pulsing heart of a people struggling to survive. The smoke swirls around you, a ghostly embrace, as the last candle flickers and dies. We are left in the absolute blackness of the medieval night, where only the sound of heavy breathing and the distant tolling of a church bell remain. The transition from the dream of the tavern to the nightmare of the morning is about to begin. The transition from the fever of the night to the grey, hollowed-out reality of the pre-dawn hours is a slow, agonizing slide. The tavern, once a roaring theatre of sensory excess, has become a graveyard of intentions. You watch as the remaining patrons shift in their sleep, their bodies contorted on the hard wooden benches, or huddled in the corners like discarded bundles of wool. The heat of the room is fading, replaced by a damp, creeping chill that seeps through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls. This is the hour of the morning after, a time when the physical, economic, and psychological toll of the medieval night becomes an inescapable weight. In the 14th century, there was no gentle return to sobriety. There was only the cold splash of reality and the crushing realization that the coins lost at the hazard table are not coming back, and the blood wipe fine for the night's brawl will likely consume the next month's labor. Historians and sociologists still argue whether the tavern functioned as a true community center or a parasitic drain on the poor. However, standing in this dim light, looking at the exhausted faces of the weavers and apprentices, the answer feels like a heavy, complicated both. The physical toll is perhaps the most immediate. The double ale that promised warmth and oblivion has delivered a brutal headache, sharpened by the lingering soot and the toxic particulates of the perpetual stew. In an age without aspirin, or even a clear understanding of hydration, the medieval hangover was a spiritual trial. You see the merchant from earlier, the one who lost his tooth, staring blankly at the cold hearth. His mouth is a swollen mess, and he knows that the only medical treatment available to him is the barber surgeon, a man who uses the same tools to cut hair as he does to lance abscesses or pull teeth. The fear of infection is a quiet background hum in his mind. In a world where a scratched knuckle in a tavern fight could lead to gangrene and death within a week, every bruise from last night is a potential death sentence. This is the soft, dramatic tension of survival. The night's fun was a high-stakes gamble with the immune system, and the house always has the advantage. Behind the counter, Master Watt is not sleeping. He is a creature of the transition, moving with a rhythmic, heavy exhaustion as he begins to tally the night's reckoning. This is the moment of truth for the tavern's shadow economy. He pulls the tally sticks from their pegs, the notched wood clicking together like bone. For many of the men in this room, these sticks represent a form of debt bondage. They have drunk their wages before they have even earned them. The landlord is not a sympathetic figure. He is the enforcer of the village's economic reality. If a man cannot pay his reckoning, Watt has the legal right to seize his cloak, his tools, or even his shoes as pawn. And you see him move toward a sleeping laborer and quietly lift a leather belt from the table, a deposit against a debt that will be collected in the morning. This quiet theft by contract is how the tavern maintains its solvency while the patrons lose theirs. There is a subtle, dark humor in the way the morning light begins to bleed through the oilcloth window coverings. It is a sickly, pale yellow light that does not illuminate so much as it exposes. It reveals the true state of the rushes on the floor, a saturated, fermenting swamp of discarded bones, spilled beer, and the occasional small dead rodent that didn't move fast enough during the brawl. The eclectic bouquet of the evening has turned into a sharp, vinegar-like stench of stale fermentation and unwashed bodies. You see the friar wake up, blinking his eyes and smoothing his dusty robes. He looks around the wreckage with a practiced, cynical grace, perhaps already composing the sermon he will give later about the Devil's Chapel, all while his own tally stick remains hanging behind the bar, notched with the very sins he will condemn. This hypocrisy is the fabric of the era, a necessary flexibility that allowed the church and the tavern to coexist in a symbiotic cycle of sin and confession. As the first bell of the nearby monastery tolls for prime, the first office of the day, the room begins to stir with a collective groan. This sound is the true lullaby of the medieval working class, the sound of a body being forced back into the harness of labor after a night of frantic, expensive escape. The transition is brutal. There are no weekends here, no sick days for a tavern-induced malaise. The apprentice must return to his master's forge, the weaver to his loom, and the merchant to the dangerous muddy roads. They move like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn in the morning light. They are leaving behind the only place where they were more than their station, where they were fellows of the cup, and returning to a world that views them as mere units of production in the feudal machine. You follow them toward the door, your own ghostly presence trailing through the settling dust. The air outside is cold and sharp, smelling of river mud and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the heavy, sticky atmosphere you are leaving. As the patrons step out, they squint against the light, pulling their cloaks tight and tucking their heads down. The tavern peace is officially over. The social hierarchy, which had blurred in the dark, snaps back into focus with the rising sun. The merchant walks ahead, the laborer falls behind, and the soldier disappears into the shadows of the alley, his hand still resting on the hilt of his dagger. The tavern has served its purpose. It has been the crucible, the sanctuary, and the trap. It remains behind, a silent, soot-blackened building that will wait through the long, bright day until the sun dips low again, and the all-stake once more promises a world where the rules are written in ale and the dark. The cycle is eternal, a heartbeat of humanity struggling for a moment of heat in a world that is fundamentally cold. The grey thin light of the early morning now carves the tavern into sharp, unforgiving geometry, revealing the shadows of the flesh market that have lingered in the periphery all night. As the heavy fog of intoxication begins to lift from the few remaining patrons, the women who occupy the most dangerous and complex positions in this hierarchy become visible in the cold light. These were the common women, a term that historians still argue over, debating whether it defined a professional class of prostitutes or simply any woman whose presence in a public alehouse marked her as available to the male gaze. In the 14th century, the tavern was the primary venue for the medieval sex trade, a business that was simultaneously condemned by the church, taxed by the state, and utilized by everyone from the highest knight to the lowliest carter. These women were the silent navigators of a legal grey area. They lived in a world where their bodies were a commodity, yet they often possessed a sharper understanding of the town's political and social currents than any guildmaster. You see one woman standing near the cold hearth, shaking the rushes from her kirtle. Her face is a map of resilience, her eyes fixed on the door with a look of practiced, weary neutrality. For her, the tavern piece was never about relaxation. It was a high-stakes negotiation where a single mistake in judging a client's temperament could lead to a permanent scar or worse. This was the soft, dramatic tension of the flesh market, a quiet, constant calculation of risk. The economy of intimacy within the tavern was not just a matter of coin, it was a matter of survival. These women often served as confidants and informants, acting as the eyes and ears of the landlord or even local officials. They knew who was hiding from the king's taxes and who was planning a strike against a rival merchant. Yet, for all their utility, they faced a reality of relentless peril. Without the protection of a guild or a family, a tavern woman was a social outcast. Her safety dependent entirely on the whims of the keeper of the chaos, Master Watt. Historians note that in many English towns, the authorities attempted to regulate this trade by forcing these women to wear specific clothing, striped hoods or particular colors, to distinguish them from virtuous wives. This was the medieval attempt at a scarlet letter, a way to maintain the social order, even as the town's elite continued to frequent the very establishments they publicly decried. There is a dark, soft humor in the irony of the local bailiff, who just hours ago was sharing a bed in the upstairs solar, now preparing to sign a decree for the cleansing of public houses. This hypocrisy was the air they breathed, a predictable and hollow theater of morality. Beyond the trade of the body, the morning light exposes the price of corrupt justice that has been paid throughout the night. You watch as the local constable, his belt heavy with the bribes of the evening, prepares to leave. He pauses to speak with Master Watt, a brief, hushed conversation that seals the fate of those who broke the tavern peace during the earlier brawl. Justice in this realm was not a blind goddess. She was a merchant with a set of scales that only responded to the weight of silver. The legal reckoning for a night's sins was entirely arbitrary. A wealthy merchant who drew blood might pay a small blood wipe, fine, and walk free, while a poor weaver, unable to pay his reckoning or a bribe, might find himself in the stocks or the thui, a punishment specifically designed for dishonest brewers and rowdy peasants. This systemic corruption was not seen as a failure of the law, but as its function. It was a way to maintain the status quo by ensuring that the tavern remained a place where the powerful could sin with impunity, while the weak paid for the privilege. Standing in the doorway, watching the constable depart, you realize that the tavern is a mirror of the world outside, just smaller, darker, and more honest about its greed. The sensory experience of the morning is a sharp, acidic contrast to the warmth of the night. The smell of the perpetual stew has turned into a cold, greasy cloying that sticks to the back of your throat. The air is no longer thick with vitality, but with the dust of the rushes being kicked up as the landlord begins the cleaning process. In a medieval tavern, cleaning was a relative term. Watt does not sweep away the debris of the night. He simply scatters a new layer of fresh straw over the top of the old, burying the lost coins, the spilled ale, and the stains of the brawl beneath a fresh green facade. Historians call this stratigraphy, the layering of time and waste that archaeologists love to dig through centuries later. To you, it is a literal burying of secrets. The filthy truth is that the tavern is built on a foundation of its own history, a rising floor of organic decay that keeps the patron slightly higher and the ceiling slightly lower with every passing year. It is a living, rotting organism that survives by consuming the lives of those who enter it. There is a profound human vulnerability in this moment of transition. The patrons are no longer the rogues gallery of the evening. They are simply people who are cold, tired, and facing a day of relentless toil. You see the young apprentice, his eyes red from smoke and weeping, trying to fix his torn tunic. He is terrified of his master's wrath, a fear that has replaced the bravado he felt while holding the dice. This is the morning after reckoning, the psychological toll of a temporary escape. The tavern offered them a moment of jollieté, a flash of merriment in a life of grey. But the price of that moment is a deeper sense of isolation. They step out into the street, and the tavern peace dissolves completely. They are once again the cogs in the feudal machine, their brief equality at the ale bench forgotten as they bow their heads to the priest and the lord. The tavern remains behind them, a silent sentinel of the night, its soot-stained walls holding the echoes of their laughter and their screams. It is the only place that knows who they truly are when the masks of society are removed, and for that reason, they will always return to it. The cycle is not just about the ale or the warmth, it is about the desperate human need to be seen, even if it is only in the flickering light of a guttering candle. The price of corrupt justice is finally tallied as the sun climbs higher, casting long, dusty fingers through the cracks of the tavern's shutters. We watch as the local beadle, a man whose official duty is to maintain the king's peace, tucks a small leather purse into the folds of his woolen tunic. This quiet exchange with Master Watt is the final ritual of the night. In the medieval tavern, justice was not a fixed point, but a fluid negotiation. Historians still argue whether this rampant bribery was a sign of a failing state or a pragmatic survival mechanism for a society with no professional police force. In this room, the law is whatever the landlord and the beadle agree. It is over a final private cup of wine. The weaver who was struck by the soldier will find no recourse in the courts. His bruises are simply the tax he paid for an ill-timed insult. Meanwhile, the merchant who lost his tooth pays a shilling to ensure the constable forgets. He was the one who threw the first tankard. This is the corrupt justice that allowed the tavern to function as a sanctuary for vice, as long as that vice remained profitable for the men in power. The morning light also exposes the shadow economy of the flesh in a way the candlelight never could. The women who inhabited the dark corners are now preparing to leave, their faces drawn and eyes hollowed by the long watch of the night. One woman, her kirtle stained with the soot of the hearth, pauses to count her meager earnings. To the church, she is a meretrix, a vessel of sin. To the town council, she is a necessary evil that prevents greater outrages against the virtuous daughters of the burgesses. But here, in the cold air of the morning, she is simply a laborer in the hardest trade of all. She navigates a world of strict liability, where she has no legal standing, yet she is the one who knows the secrets of every man who crossed the threshold. There is a soft, bitter humor in seeing the very priest who will preach against the harlot later today, slipping out the back door with his head bowed low. This hypocrisy is the bedrock of the tavern's survival. It is a place where the private truths of humanity are allowed to exist, provided they are paid for in silver and silence. The physical aftermath of the night is a visceral reality that the fresh straw cannot entirely hide. As Master Watt moves through the room, he kicks at the rushes, revealing a lost copper long cross penny or a broken piece of a bone comb. The floor is a geological record of human desperation. Beneath the new layer of straw lies a decomposing soup of organic matter, the perpetual stew of the floor. It is a breeding ground for the fleas and lice that were the constant companions of the medieval person. You can almost feel the phantom itch as the dust rises. Every breath you take in this morning air is laden with the history of the room's occupants. It is a reminder that, in the 14th century, health was a fragile temporary state, and the tavern was the most dangerous environment one could inhabit. Yet, people flocked here because the alternative was the cold, silent isolation of a dark hovel. The tavern provided a raw vitality, a sense of being alive that was worth the risk of the bloody flux or a soldier's blade. The morning after also brings the psychological toll into sharp focus. You see the young apprentice sitting on the front step, his head in his hands, staring at the mud of the street. The joviality of the night has vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of his master's impending wrath, and the hangover that feels like a hot iron behind his eyes. He has spent his week's wages on a few hours of illusion. This cycle of extravagant sin and bitter penance was the rhythm of medieval life. The tavern was the pressure valve that kept the social boiler from exploding. Without these nights of chaotic heart and temporary escape, the rigid, suffocating rules of the guild and the manor would have been unbearable. The tavern survived because it was the only place where a man could forget, for a few hours, that he was little more than a piece of property belonging to his lord or his craft. As we prepare to leave this soot-blackened sanctuary, we realize that the tavern is a mirror reflecting the full complexity of the human condition. It is a place of brutality and community, of creation and destruction. Master Watt finally pulls back the heavy iron bar of the front door, and the roar of the morning market floods in, the shouting of fishmongers, the lowing of cattle, and the ringing of the blacksmith's anvil. The tavern piece is officially over, and the world of commerce and duty has returned. But as the patrons drift out, they carry the filthy truth of the night with them. They are bound by the shared secret of the dark, a silent communion of the cup that will bring them back again as soon as the sun dips below the horizon. The tavern is the eternal heart of the town, the place where humanity is stripped of its pretense and forced to face itself in the flickering light of a guttering candle. We step out into the street, the cold air hitting our faces, and the tavern door groans shut behind us, holding its secrets tight until the next moonrise. The sun is now high, its rays piercing through the dusty air of the street. But for the patrons of the tavern, the reckoning of the morning is only just beginning to settle into their bones. We watch as the room undergoes a slow, painful transformation from a sanctuary of shadows into a starkly lit stage of consequence. This is the moment when the physical, economic, and psychological toll of the night becomes a tangible weight. The tavern peace, that fragile suspension of social gravity, has evaporated completely. In its place is the morning after reality of 14th century life, where a single night of excess can ripple through a person's existence for weeks. Historians still argue whether the tavern served as a vital social lubricant that prevented greater civil unrest, or if it was a predatory machine designed to keep the working class in a perpetual state of debt and dependency. Looking at the characters before us, the answer feels like a jagged, uncomfortable truth that encompasses both. The economic reckoning is the most immediate. Master Watt stands behind his counter. The tally sticks spread out before him like the teeth of a trap. For many of the laborers now stumbling toward the door, these pieces of notched wood represent a significant portion of their future labor already sold for a few hours of double ale and perpetual stew. This was the shadow economy of the tavern, a system of credit that functioned in the absence of the banks, but with a ruthlessness that no modern bank would dare. If a man cannot pay his reckoning, Watt does not call for a lawyer. He simply keeps the man's cloak or his boots as pawn. This practice of distraint was common and legal, turning the tavern keeper into a part-time pawnbroker. You see the young apprentice from the dice table pleading with Watt, his voice cracking with a mixture of hangover and terror. He has lost his master's coins, and without them, he faces the stocks or a public whipping. The landlord's face remains a mask of indifferent stone. He has seen this tragedy play out 1,000 times, and his priority is the solvency of his own house, not the salvation of a foolish boy. The physical toll is equally relentless. The visceral setting that felt cozy in the candlelight now feels like a biological hazard. The air is thick with the smell of stale fermentation, cold grease, and the unmistakable metallic tang of the previous night's violence. In an era without basic hygiene, the tavern floor was a literal ecosystem of decay. As Watt scatters a fresh layer of rushes over the old, he is burying the physical evidence of the night's sins, but he is also sealing in a layer of filth that will continue to ferment and breed vermin. Historians note that the spread of the Black Death and other plagues was often accelerated by the close, unsanitary conditions of these public houses. Every patron leaving the tavern this morning carries more than just a headache. They carry the fleas and lice that thrive in the straw, the invisible passengers of a world where bathing was a seasonal luxury. The soft, dramatic tension of the morning is the silent knowledge that a simple scratch from a broken mug or a bruise from a stool can turn into a lethal infection within days. This was the filthy truth of medieval life. The cost of a night's release was often paid in the currency of one's own health. Psychologically, the transition is a brutal return to the rigid social order. The rogues gallery of the night, the merchant, the soldier, the pilgrim, and the thief, now separate into their respective roles. The temporary equality of the ale bench is a memory that fades as soon as they step over the threshold. The merchant pulls his cloak tight, his mind already calculating how to explain the loss of his tooth and his coins to his guild. The soldier vanishes into the alleyways, a man of war who finds no peace in the light. The alewife, who was the queen of the taps just hours ago, is now back to the drudgery of cleaning the copper kettles and preparing the next batch of mash. There is a profound human vulnerability in this moment. The tavern offered them a space where they could be more than their station, where luck could momentarily triumph over birth and breeding. But the morning light is the ultimate enforcer of the feudal system. It reminds them that they are cogs in a machine that demands their labor, their obedience, and their taxes. As we watch the last patron disappear into the crowd of the morning market, we realize that the tavern is not just a building. It is a mirror of the human condition. It reflects our capacity for both community and brutality, for the desperate search for connection, and the inevitable pull of self-destruction. The morning after is not the end of the story. It is simply the pause before the cycle begins again. The tavern will wait, its soot-stained walls holding the echoes of the night, until the sun dips low, and the ale stake, once more, promises a world where the rules can be forgotten, if only for the price of a penny. The morning light has now fully claimed the tavern, casting a cold, clinical glare upon the eternal human refuge that has stood as a silent witness to the night's frantic pulse. We stand in the center of the room, watching the final motes of dust dance in the sunbeams that pierce the soot-stained air. The filthy truth of the medieval tavern is finally laid bare. It was never just a place of vice, nor was it merely a den of danger. It was the vital, beating heart of a society that had nowhere else to turn for a moment of heat, a sip of safety, or the company of another soul. As Master Watt begins to bank the embers of the hearth for the day, preparing the perpetual stew for its next evolution, we reflect on the enduring story of this institution. Historians still argue whether the tavern was the birthplace of modern democracy, a space where free speech was born in the steam of ale, or a cage that kept the peasantry distracted and indebted. But as we look at the scarred tables and the fresh green rushes covering the sins of the night, the answer is found in the human vulnerability of those who sought its shelter. The tavern survived because it met the most primal of human needs: the need to escape the rigid social rules and the crushing weight of a hostile world. It was a place where a stranger might become a friend or an enemy before dawn, and where the volatile nexus of life was condensed into a single smoky room. This is the compelling truth that resonates across the centuries. We are not so different from the merchant, the soldier, or the alewife. We all seek a sanctuary where the light is warm and the world outside feels far away. The tavern was a mirror of the medieval soul, brutal, resilient, superstitious, and deeply, beautifully human. It was a space where luck could momentarily triumph over birth, a dream that humanity has never stopped chasing. As the landlord finally latches the shutters, plunging the room back into a protective, artificial twilight, we feel the weight of the ages settling into the timbers. The tavern is a cycle of creation and destruction, a ship sailing through the darkness of history, carrying the stories of millions who have long since turned to dust. The morning after has finally faded into the routine of the day, but the tavern remains, a silent promise of the night to come. We take one last breath of the heavy, yeasty air, feeling the raw vitality of the past brush against our skin like a ghost. The story of the medieval tavern is the story of us, struggling for meaning in the chaos, seeking a seat by the fire, and hoping that the tavern peace will hold just long enough for one last song. The door is barred now. The streets of the 14th century are loud with commerce, and our journey through the smoke and shadow is complete. We leave the tavern behind, but we carry its warmth and its darkness within us. A reminder that even in the filthiest of truths, there is a flickering light of community that never truly goes out. Now, let the sounds of the medieval market fade into a distant, gentle hum. The clatter of hooves and the shouting of the beadle are becoming softer, like a melody played on a lute behind a heavy curtain. The air around you is turning cool and clean, smelling of soft linen and the quiet of the night. Feel your muscles relax, sinking into the soft support beneath you as the heavy iron-bound door of history finally clicks shut. The shadows of the tavern are no longer frightening. They are a velvet blanket, wrapping you in the safety of the present. You are far away from the smoke, the grit, and the danger. The tally sticks are settled, the reckoning is paid, and there is nothing left for you to do but drift. Imagine the golden amber of the ale turning into the soft, shimmering light of the moon. Sleep is coming now, as inevitable as the rising tide, carrying you into a dreamless, peaceful dark. Sweet dreams.